Hey there, how are you today? Today's topic is one that I have gotten requests about, specifically asking me to address this subject, and that is, do sex offenders, sexual abusers, belong in church? Now, in today's culture of increased awareness about abuse, more and more faith communities of all denominations end up grappling with some really heavy questions. Now, I just want to say, if this is something that you have wondered, I see a lot of you already coming on, watching. If you have wondered about whether or not sex offenders belong in church, this is definitely the time to share this. Hit share on this video at the bottom and repost it to your timeline. Maybe there's someone in your faith community that's going to need to hear this. You can send it forward or just hit share and repost. Any of that, it's great. It helps get this message out to more people so that our faith communities can be safer for everyone involved. Now, as the faith community continues grappling with really heavy questions, we see church leaders and church members, parents, teachers, children's department workers, all asking questions like, how should the church treat people who have a history of causing harm to vulnerable victims? Can you ever know if someone is truly repentant enough to be around kids safely ever again? Aren't we called to love everyone like Jesus did? What does that look like in action? Isn't it cruel to tell anyone that they aren't welcome to worship where everyone else is? What about forgiveness? Shouldn't we show kindness instead of being harsh to those who are sexual offenders and abusers? So all of these questions deserve grappling with. Haphazard responses, or even ignoring the topic altogether, is what gets more kids molested by people they trusted. And then we're responsible for that. That's blood on our hands. So refusing to wrestle with the disturbing data and the uncomfortable concepts leads to blind naivety and irresponsible safety risks. We don't want to be doing that, right? So let's talk about some of the most common phrases that I hear people saying, wrestling with, or pushing back with when they're talking about whether or not sex offenders belong in church. So here's one. But we do background checks on all our children's volunteers. All our children's staff are vetted. We're safe, right? You're wrong. So here's why that's not enough. Background checks only catch offenders that were careless enough or stupid enough or bold enough to have gotten caught and convicted. Background checks do not always catch offenders who were even convicted in other states or in other counties, depending on the type of background check you run. Also, background checks may not show offenders who were originally charged with a very high degree of child abuse or sexual molestation, and then they pled down to lower charges, and then they didn't have to register as offenders. So that's a whole category of legitimately convicted offenders that may not get flagged depending on your background check. Also, just because you or your church or your community organization is doing background checks on the children's department volunteers or staff doesn't mean that the rest of your staff are being vetted. And what if your treasurer or your superintendent or one of your deacons or someone else who doesn't work with children regularly is not vetted? They do have something in their history, and they use their status in that position that isn't in the children's department to still have access to trusting children or trusting families. There's so many ways that can go wrong. Here's another one. We allow sex offenders to attend our family-friendly church, but we keep a close eye on them and we don't let them wander down the children's wing. It sounds nice. It sounds like you're giving a lot of grace and understanding while still trying to make sure that it's a safe place. It doesn't work. Jimmy Hinton, who check him out at jimmyhinton.org. He's written articles about this. They're fantastic. I highly recommend his work. He's an expert in this area. But think about this with me and think about any one of the 1,000 ways that this could go wrong. Having sex offenders attend your family-friendly church and keeping a close eye on them may include something like, these are different ways that I've heard churches deal with this. It may include something like having the offender sign a private memorandum of understanding or some kind of private document that says that they will not go to the children's wing, they will not be alone with children, and they agree to have a chaperone, a deacon, or an elder, or someone assigned to them to help supervise them to make sure that they don't go anywhere they're not supposed to go or be anywhere they're not supposed to be. So here's it just doesn't work on so many levels. First of all, very often, the person assigned to chaperone the offender is not fully educated in exactly what is needed in that role in order to be safe. And sexual offenders are by nature extremely charming, extremely charismatic, extremely good with people in general. And if their chaperone is not thoroughly educated on how well offenders can groom and deceive, they are very likely to let things slip simply because they are being groomed themselves. Another thing is, far too often, churches don't realize that a sex offender who they find out is attending their church may very well be in blatant violation of their parole or their offender registry conditions. Oftentimes, registered sex offenders have clauses in their parole conditions that say they can never be within a certain number of hundreds of feet of children, or they can never be around minors. They come to church, and if someone finds out, or they happen to disclose that they are on the registered on the sex offender registry, very often churches and leaders just think, oh, this is great. This person wants to be in a faith-oriented environment. They want to be at our church, so we're going to facilitate that for them. And they don't even realize they are helping that offender violate the conditions of their parole or their release. So it is super important to check with someone's parole officer immediately if you find out that they're coming to church or they are in any of your church activities, in homes, off-campus church activities, on-campus church activities, any of it. Now, imagine this scenario with me. Let's say that a church is doing everything that they know to do. They're doing it right. So they've got a chaperone, they've got a memorandum of understanding where the offender says that they are willing to not be around children. The offender is not hanging out or volunteering in the children's wing or in the children's departments. And the church leadership is aware that this person is involved or attending. So this church feels like they've done everything they can do, while they also are believing that they are protecting the right to privacy or the right to, what's the term I'm thinking of? The right to while they're protecting the identity of the offender. They're not making any announcements about it, et cetera, but they're letting him come to church, and they feel that they have put a lot of safety precautions into place. So now imagine with me the families, the children, the parents in this congregation. They don't know that this person is a registered sex offender. They just think that the person they're chaperoning with is just like a really great buddy, and those two go everywhere together. And they don't realize that that's actually an official chaperone, or maybe there are 2 or 3 assigned to chaperone, and so they kind of rotate off, and the average family member, parent, child doesn't put 2 and 2 together. Then you have someone who is a predator, has a predatory mindset, and they are involved with the adult side of church activities. They attend and so on and so forth. So as they do this, the church thinks we've got this under control. We have provided sufficient safety measures. The predator thinks this is a way for me to gain trust. And so in attending, they become a familiar face. Now, what, tell me, is to stop that person, that offender, from observing, watching the young people, the children in the congregation, singling out someone or a few of them that they believe are good candidates for abuse, that are likely to be able to be manipulated and groomed, because sex offenders do that. They choose their targets, and then showing up. What's to prevent them from showing up at the ball game, at the baseball field, at band practice, at the local children's club, at the Y, at the swim meet, at volunteering as a local coach or something else where people don't know who they are, and then approaching those children from church, because at church, this person is a familiar face. None of these children know that this person is a registered sex offender. They don't know that they should be cautious around them. And because presence at church in many people's minds equals an endorsement of trustworthiness and character as an individual, that child is very likely to think, he's from church, he must be safe. I've seen this person with other people I know, and then outside of church, somewhere else in the community, that offender is able to gain trusted access to the church's young people because the church tried to protect their anonymity. Here's another one. Our leaders know who the sex offenders are in our community, but those offenders have a right to privacy too, so we don't tell any of the parents or any of the members in our congregation. So if you are a leader who's taken this stance, have you thought of the risks that you are taking with this course of action? Sexual perpetrators love to curry favor and build social capital, have social equity with people who are in higher positions of power, in order to later provide cover and help silence victims who may try to speak out. You can read more about this in my book, which is available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback, called Myths We Believe, Predators We Trust. And that is 37 things that you ought to know about abuse in the faith community, but you really wish you didn't have to. And perpetrators also tend to be likable. They tend to be friendly. They tend to be helpful. They will become indispensable. Whatever it takes to ensure the enthusiastic support and loyal defense of their character, if ever anything comes up. Whatever it takes to make sure the heavy hitters will back them up and will support them. It happens over and over and over again. So just having the church leaders know who a sex offender is not enough, because those individuals are prime fodder for being groomed and cultivating a sense of loyalty and connection with the perpetrator. Here's another one. We had an offender join our congregation, but there was only one victim, and he was super, super sorry, and he wasn't ever even convicted. So we knew that he was safe now because he had repented and there was only one victim. Here's the truth behind that myth, and that is there's almost never just one victim. In the book Predators by Anna Salter, which I highly recommend, it says that in reality, data shows that the average sexual offender has between 50 and 150 victims before their first arrest, and many more after the first arrest, because very rarely does a first arrest end up with enough evidence to actually end in prosecution, charges, or conviction. Rarely does a rapist or a sex offender spend a single day in jail. Fewer than 6 out of every 1,000 rapists will even spend one day in jail. Predators nearly always have multiple victims, and they will often have several victims at the same time that are in some variety of stages of grooming or degrees of abuse. You can read all about that in the book Predators by Anna Salter. You can also check out RAINN.org, RAINN.org, for data on how many, like the 6 out of 1,000 rapists that ever spend a day in jail. There are 100 different reasons that a completely guilty abuser may not get prosecuted, may not even get charged, and may not have to register as a sex offender. Reasons can include things like, hey, the prosecutor was overloaded. It's an election year, and the DA, the district attorney, decided not to take that case on. They decided that the fragility of the victim was the victim was too fragile to be able to handle being cross-examined and on the stand, and so they did not press charges in the case. They might have had a number of witnesses or some really solid evidence, and then there's some technical issue with evidence, or witnesses decide, you know what, hey, I'm not up for the beating that it will take emotionally, physically, socially of participating in trial, so I'm not willing to testify. There can be plea deals that plead like third-degree sexual assault down to, or rape of a minor down to some kind of misdemeanor based on information someone has, or however overloaded the court system is at that point. And so the person who was actually guilty of, say, raping a very young child might actually not get charged with the statutes that would be equal to the crime that they actually committed. There can be jurisdiction conflicts. Things happened in more than one jurisdiction, and so there was a turf war and behind the scenes, and then nobody ended up following through to get justice. So there are any number of reasons why someone may be very, very guilty, completely guilty of sexual abuse in possibly multiple victims, but still has not been charged, prosecuted, convicted, or registered as a sex offender. You have to keep that in mind. So now here's another one. People say, oh, if someone hurt one of our women or children in our church and we found out, we would definitely believe them and take action. But here's the problem. The perpetrator usually presents well and appears more believable. Their story is convincing and well delivered, and it makes sense. And churches tend to equate forgiveness with reconciliation and reinstatement, especially when the abuser is someone charming with an influential position, and they put them right back where they can abuse again and again with just some sorry and tears and a show of repentance, fake repentance in between. Even when perpetrators are registered sex offenders and convicted criminals, churches still tend to embrace them and allow them to interact with the church freely under the guise of false interpretations of forgiveness. Church leaders often offer this, they roll out this red carpet of belief and love and forgiveness and support and restoration and sometimes even promotion instead of safety agreements, accountability, and insisting on accountability and safety as a priority for the vulnerable. So, this leads to another question. Are you saying God can't change a sex offender? Isn't that denying the power of the gospel? Are you saying that just because someone's a sex addict or just because someone has been assaulted someone in the past or raped someone before, that they can never be saved? Of course not. No one is beyond the power of God's redemption. But God does not violate anyone's free will to force them to change either. Doesn't matter what you think. God can't, or what you think about a situation, I mean. God, doesn't matter how much you pray, not even God can force someone to choose to be a decent human being if they are determined to hurt other people. And by the time someone has rejected their conscience so many thousands of times that they are able to harm a child or rape a woman or a man, the odds of them choosing to change are truly very slim to none. That doesn't mean that those actions are beyond the chance of salvation. It means that in order to be someone who is capable of perpetrating sexual assault, rape, molestation, incest, in order to be capable of doing that to another of God's children, your conscience is already so dead that someone appealing to your conscience or telling you that you need to change is highly unlikely to actually result in transformation. And even if someone does say that they're changing, there's absolutely no way to be certain that they're not manipulating you in order to gain your trust and get access to victims again. There's no way to know until after the fact. Later, when more children or women's or other people's, vulnerable people's lives have been devastated. So if you are a spiritual leader on any level, we believe, and I believe the Bible supports that sexual aggression, sexual assault, rape, sexual abuse is a one and done type of offense. Yes, you forgive. Yes, if someone says they are repenting, you rejoice with them over their repentance. But no, you do not bring the wolf home to bunk in the sheepfold with the lambs. Not even if he swears on his mother's life that he has lost all taste for lamb chops. You do not bring the wolf home to bunk with the lambs, period. Because to do so makes you a negligent shepherd of the lambs. If shut-ins and the ill and the chronically fatigued and the elderly can worship at home, if they can participate in online services, in online activities, why not those who have proven that they will exploit the trust placed in them to cause life-shattering harm? Sex offenders can worship at home. They can worship with online access. They can worship at adult-only services that are led by trained professionals and therapists in the area of sexual assault and sexual addiction, with security present. But they do not belong in the family-friendly church organization around potential victims. Here's something else, just a couple of more. A lot of people say, but our church doesn't have any sex offenders. Yes, you do. They just haven't been caught yet. And if you believe that you don't have any domestic violence abusers, have any sex offenders, you are sticking your head in the sand like an ostrich and ignoring up to 1/3 of your congregation who is on the receiving end at any given time of abuse. Here's another one. If you're too harsh on sex offenders, aren't you telling them that God isn't loving? Okay, fair question. But if you're too easy on them, aren't you telling them that God isn't just? And if you don't do anything about letting sex offenders move freely or even with limitations in your family-friendly congregation, aren't you telling the vulnerable that God doesn't care about protecting them? Aren't you telling the children that they're not worth it to you to actually take uncomfortable steps to make sure they're safe? We find it easier to wish reconciliation into existence than we do to stay involved in the process of monitoring safety and risking the wrath of an unrepentant predator who insists on their rights to maintain access to power and influence. When we fail to require appropriate ongoing accountability structures, to insist on long-term therapy and the involvement of professionals, to place the safety and well-being of our children and our vulnerable first, and to implement appropriate, healthy safety structures, what we are truly doing is refusing to prioritize the protection of present and future victims. In doing so, we also misrepresent God's character of love and justice on behalf of the vulnerable. And what is the gospel if it is not to protect the vulnerable? That's what Jesus spent his whole life doing, is protecting those who could not protect themselves. So next time someone says, oh, well, we just need to show them some love, and we just need to maybe, make sure that they don't go down the children's wing, and we'll keep an eye on them. You remind those leaders that showing love means doing the best possible thing to bring that person to salvation. And that means not allowing them into any circumstance that would give them an opportunity to damage their character and lose their salvation by causing harm to someone else. If someone has that proclivity, the way to love them best is to keep them far away from every prospective victim, so that they have the opportunity to eventually find genuine repentance. All right, this is a super tough subject, and I went a little longer than I thought I would, but hey, there's a lot of stuff to say about this, and I would like to know your thoughts. If you are someone who has observed or been in the middle of a situation like this, I would love to hear, drop me a comment. I'd love to hear how your church handled it. Did they do a great job? Could they have done a better job? Did they enable the perpetrator? What happened in your experience? What have you observed? And do you know a church who needs to hear this message in order to be a safer place for the vulnerable? Obviously, I think you should share this. Pass it on to your pastor, pass it on to your church leaders, repost it on your profile, whatever it takes. And I would like to hear your thoughts. This is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, so I'll be doing more of these. If you have other specific questions you'd like me to address in a video, drop a comment, send me a message. And in the meantime, live wild.